Hey everyone, my name is Ben Chaish, and today we are talking about the amazing Canon R6. While this video doesn't have a sponsor, it is supported by those of you who have bought my presets or subscribed to my Patreon. All of those things are what makes making a YouTube channel and these videos happen, because frankly, I don't make enough money on these YouTube videos yet to warrant the amount of time I put into it, but it is something that I really appreciate and want to be a resource for the community. Now, I've been using the R6 for probably a year and a half now or so. It has primarily actually been the camera that I've been filming all of my YouTube videos on, all of my video content for Patreon and all of those other things. But it's also another camera that I bring to weddings as both like a backup and something that has autofocus. And it's just obviously a great camera, performs amazing in low light, all sorts of stuff like that. And honestly, in the Canon ecosystem, it is probably the camera out there that is going to check the most boxes for the most amount of people. So let's talk about the good, the bad, what I love, what I don't love as much, and see if this camera might be the right fit for you. So again, I've used this camera for well over a year now and have put a decent amount of images on it, and also have clearly filmed a lot of YouTube videos on this as well. And as I know a lot of people kind of do both that watch this channel, I'll jump into a few of the video things right off the bat, and then we can clearly jump into photography stuff. The 4K video out of this camera is fantastic. I've always really loved the colors and the just general picture out of Canon cameras. I think that most people would agree that generally Canon is known for having good skin tones. And as someone who didn't know a ton about video and color grading and all that kind of stuff, I will say that starting in the Canon ecosystem was probably the easier way to go in that spot, because it just is such a good video camera and has such a good color profile that obviously I was pretty familiar with. Now, the 4K 60 has a very slight crop, but to be honest, that was not something that was an issue for me. Mostly when I was doing 4K 60, I was just doing product B-roll and whatnot. So honestly, the extra little push in was slightly helpful, and I didn't really see it as an issue. And while the files weren't brutal to edit because I had an M1 Mac, I did end up purchasing the Atomos Ninja 5 and started just recording in ProRes and ProRes Lite, because the editing process in doing that was so much faster and easier. So while you can obviously shoot great stuff in this camera just internally, if you don't have a newer machine and you want to shoot a bunch of 4K and do layering stuff and color grading, the base files out of here definitely are a little bit intensive on a computer. So I guess keep that in mind. Now this will kind of dovetail into the photography metrics as well, but the autofocus on this camera is by far one of the best that I have ever seen, ever used. It tracks eyes incredibly well. It's just been a fantastic workhorse in those means. I just don't worry about missing focus when I'm using an autofocus lens. Even a third-party lens like this Viltrox here, it just does fantastic. Now, I will say one of the things that really annoyed me about this camera, though, in the video aspect, was that you simply have just this little dial right here, and then you have custom 1, 2, and 3, but those custom modes can't be used in video. So if I wanted to switch between 4K 24 or 4K 60 or even like a cropped mode or something like that, all I could do was keep it on the video mode, and then I had to go into the settings and change it manually. And I know that doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you're doing it over and over and over with, you know, doing these YouTube videos or whatever, all those little steps do end up taking time and reduce my workflow. So it was definitely an annoyance. The other thing that is sort of a pro but also a con is that this camera did get C-Log 3, which is a good picture profile. It obviously records 10 bits, all that stuff is great, but the fact that you don't get C-Log 2, and I know that even the R5C doesn't get that, I do really, really wish that it had a higher dynamic range profile, a flatter image, so that I could get more cinematic looking images. The other thing that's obviously a bit annoying about these cameras is that it just has an artificial 29-minute, 59-second record limit. I don't often do these talking head things for that long anyway, but just the idea that if I was doing a wedding or something like that, if it was longer than half an hour, I'd have to like walk over and make sure the camera is still running. And I just think that's a dumb thing that camera companies now, because they don't have that tariff or that tax or whatever, it's just an artificial limitation that they're doing. But I will say that in my office studio here, when I have these lights on and had been doing, you know, product B-roll at 4K 60, I never timed it or anything, but those were the only times where I did have this camera overheat. It was mainly when it was really hot in here and I was using 4K 60 for an extended period of time, doing multiple B-roll segments and whatnot. So while I never had an issue at 4K 24, and I've definitely never had an issue in photo mode, overheating did occur for me in warm environments at 4K 60 during, you know, kind of extended runtimes. So now that we've established that honestly it's a great video camera for the vast majority of people, and if you are a photographer that owns this camera or is thinking about buying this camera and just want to do a little bit of video kind of on the side, this camera is incredible for that. But then for many of us who do weddings, I think that the vast majority are probably going to be hopping onto this camera if they haven't already, and there's a decent amount of reasons why. First of all, this camera is less expensive than the Canon R5 by about $1,000. You're getting fantastic image quality, great high ISO performance, maybe the best autofocus I've ever used in a camera, all in a package that is, you know, around $2,500. And the other thing is that many who have been using the Canon system for a long time and have a plethora of EF lenses, the adapters on here make your EF glass work better than it has ever worked before. It makes the transition from, you know, a 5D Mark III, a 5D Mark IV onto something like this a lot more palatable, because then you can keep your existing lenses and upgrade them over time. The RF lenses are fantastic, but that being said, the overall cost of switching from a DSLR into mirrorless because of those adapters and how good they are makes this, again, a little bit more palatable. Now, in my testing, the high ISO performance, which for me as a wedding photographer is crucial, is fantastic. It's definitely a beast in low light. It's probably not the best camera that I've ever used, but high ISO images on this come out pretty darn clean for what they are. The other thing that most people are going to see kind of for the first time is the IBIS. And the IBIS is, again, another thing that can kind of just help photographers save an image if you need to shoot at a lower shutter speed. But if you're photographing things like a speech or whatever and people are going to be moving a lot, this is at 1/50th of a second, and you can see that my hand is blurry. And if you stopped one of those still frames, I'd have a really blurry hand. So you still have to be careful about your shutter speed. The IBIS still is really, really helpful. And even just the viewing experience through the viewfinder is helpful as well. Now, I will say that this isn't Canon's, you know, highest end camera, so a few of the things are a bit disappointing here, but I totally understand what they are and why they are as such for the price point. The little flip LCD screen here is
good, not great,
but there's a pretty decent bezel going on here, which is a bit annoying, seeing how it's just such a big screen and then the bezel is enormous on it for some reason. And then the EVF in here is fine. Again, it's one of those things where it's not great, but it's not bad necessarily. It's just like, you can see the pixels, and many of us who are just used to things like, you know, iPhones and iPads and Retina displays in general, you know, the user experience of it isn't fantastic, especially because I've used other cameras that have better viewfinders and are more clear, all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely usable. Having an EVF on here clearly is fantastic and helps with the image making process, but it is one of the downfalls of this camera, is that just in general, the viewing experience isn't as good as some other cameras out there. The ergonomics of this camera are great, but I do wish that this still had the top screen. That was just nice on the EOS R and obviously on the R5 and R5C. One of the things I will mention too is that I really do love all these cameras now have USB-C charging. So it just means that I can often have less batteries that I need to buy or bring, because even if I was running really low, I could just use a power bank in my pocket and plug it in here if I really, really needed more power. So it's just a really handy feature there and makes that part easier. But the thing that most people are going to complain about, and I totally understand why, is the 20 megapixel sensor. Now, the 20 megapixel sensor does allow you to get good low light performance and probably makes the buffer faster and all of those things. But now in 2022, 20 megapixels again is enough. But if you're someone that does a lot of cropping and or if you do landscapes or things like that, it's just at like the bottom line of what I would consider like a professional image to be needing to be at. Again, it's not the end of the world, but especially if you need to crop a lot or whatever. I personally don't crop a lot, so it's not that big a deal to me. Just when even the EOS R had like 30 megapixels or whatever, and then they dropped this one to 20, it just felt like if they could have even pushed it to 24 or something like that, it would have just felt a lot more professional. But that being said, for someone like a wedding photographer that's just, you know, doing thousands of images a weekend, 20 megapixels for the most part is going to be plenty. And then if you did really need to blow one up, there are a lot of ways you can do that in both Photoshop and now Lightroom. So not the end of the world, but I do wish it was just a little bit higher. So overall, here is, I guess, my general recommendation. If you are still sitting on a 5D Mark III, a 6D2, a 5D Mark IV, any of the DSLRs, an upgrade to the R6, I think, is probably the play unless you want those higher megapixels. For me, I'm just not the kind of person that has a ton of money to burn all the time in upgrading to a bunch of different things. So I do think that, again, as a wedding photographer, buying 2 of these bodies would be a fantastic idea. And then in doing that, you're going to be saving a couple $1,000s, which you could put towards probably an RF lens over buying 2 R5s. So ultimately, it just makes the transition between DSLR to mirrorless be a lot more painless because, again, you can use your existing lenses. And then the price point isn't terrible. You can pick up a couple of these new for $5,000. And then all you need is a couple of adapters, and then you can kind of be good to go for a while you transition. And then again, if you were looking to do any sort of video stuff, this is a fantastic video camera. It does 10-bit 422 4K up to 60 frames a second. Normally for this stuff, I use 24 frames a second. So ultimately, it's just kind of Canon's best prosumer all-around hybrid camera for, I think, the masses. People who don't necessarily want to spend the extra money on a pair of R5s, but do want a lot of the performance and all the new features and whatnot that their new mirrorless system has. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions about this and my experience with it, please let me know in the comments below. Give this video a like if you appreciated the content and want to help push it out to more people. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all on the next one.